What would you do if you discovered your husband was hiding a secret and every sign pointed to one devastating conclusion? He was having an affair? I didn't wait for an answer. When the late night text messages started appearing, when money kept disappearing from our savings account, when he began locking the drawer of his desk and coming home with a distant look in his eyes, I became convinced that the man I had loved for 10 years was living a second life behind my back. I hired a private investigator to follow my husband. I gathered evidence. I prepared for a divorce, certain in my mind that I was the victim. But then, the day I opened the sealed envelope hidden inside that locked desk drawer, I realized that the one who had betrayed the trust in our marriage might not have been him. And by the time I learned the whole truth, I did something that, for the rest of my life, I may never forgive myself for. If you looked at our life from the outside, you'd probably think I was one of the luckiest women in America. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 33 years old, and I own a small flower shop in the suburbs of Seattle, a place where every morning begins with the scent of freshly delivered roses, the cheerful jingle of the doorbell, and customers searching for the perfect bouquet for a birthday, a wedding, or a long overdue apology. I used to love that job. It made me feel like I was helping create some of the most beautiful moments in other people's lives. My husband, Ryan Carter, is an architect. He's the kind of man any mother would hope her daughter marries. Hardworking, responsible. He doesn't drink excessively or stay out partying all night. He never forgets to pay Lily's school tuition or get the car's oil changed on schedule. Ryan isn't the kind of man who walks into a room and commands everyone's attention. He's the kind of man who quietly fixes a sticking door, wakes up early to shovel snow from the driveway in the winter at spots, and always double-checks the locks before going to bed. We've been married for 10 years. We have an 8-year-old daughter named Lily, a little girl who loves Sunday morning pancakes and insists that our golden retriever wear a party hat for his birthday celebrations. We live in a 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood north of Seattle. On weekends, Ryan mows the lawn. I tend to the flower beds on our front porch. Lily rides her bike around the neighborhood with the other kids on the block. From the outside, everything looked perfect. At least, that's what everyone thought. But no one could see the silence growing between us. Ryan became quieter and quieter. The conversations we had as husband and wife revolved around utility bills, Lily's school schedule, and who would pick her up after school. We still sat down and had dinner together. But sometimes, I felt as though I was sitting across from a polite roommate rather than the man who once made my heart race. The scariest part wasn't the arguments. It was that we had stopped arguing, stopped asking each other what was on our minds, stopped telling each other how our days had gone. I began to wonder whether Ryan even saw me anymore, or if, in his eyes, I had become nothing more than the woman who cooked dinner, paid the electric bill, and reminded Lily to brush her teeth before bed. There were nights when I lay beside my husband, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing in the darkness, and felt so lonely that I wanted to cry. But I never imagined that this growing distance between us would lead us to the edge of something neither of us could have foreseen. Because I had no idea that a single text message appearing that evening would change everything. At first, I told myself I was overthinking things. Ryan was just busier than usual, a new project at work, long meetings, job-related stress. That's just adult life, right? But then the little things started to appear. And they piled up like tiny drops of water falling onto a stone, bit by bit, until I could no longer pretend not to see them. Ryan started coming home late, not once in a while, but 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. He used to text me whenever he had to work overtime. "I'll be home about 30 minutes late," or "Don't wait up for dinner." But now, I glance at the clock and realize it was nearly 8 o'clock at night without having received a single explanation. Lily would sit at the dinner table and ask, "Is Dad going to make it home in time to read me a story tonight, Mom?" I'd smile and answer, "I'm sure he'll be home soon." But the truth was, I didn't know. Then one evening, just as Ryan walked through the front door, his phone buzzed. I only happened to notice it by accident. The screen lit up. There was only a single letter, M. Ryan immediately picked up his phone and flipped it face down on the table. Too quickly. too naturally, as if it were a reflex he'd practiced many times before. "Work message?" I asked. He took about 2 seconds before answering. "Yeah, just a client. 2 seconds. It doesn't sound like much. But when you've lived with someone for 10 years, you start noticing the hesitations other people would never catch. From that day on, I paid closer attention. Ryan no longer left his phone on the kitchen counter the way he used to. He took it with him into the bathroom. He took it with him when he went out to take out the trash. He even carried it with him when he stepped into the backyard. The distance between us grew too, in ways that were hard to define. He was still polite. He still asked how my day had been. He still kissed Lily goodnight. But the hugs disappeared. The good morning kisses became rushed and absent-minded. Some nights, I'd roll over toward him in bed, only to realize Ryan was lying with his back turned to me. Then there was the money. One afternoon at the flower shop, I logged into our joint savings account to pay one of our suppliers, and I froze. $5,000, gone. 2 weeks later, another $3,000, then another $2,000. Large sums of money were being transferred out with alarming regularity. I wanted to ask him about it that very night, but then I noticed Ryan's desk drawer. It was locked. In 10 years of marriage, Ryan had never locked anything away from me. Not his phone, not his computer, not our bank accounts. And yet now, he was locking his desk drawer. I stood there in the quiet of his home office, staring at that tiny lock, and for the first time in my marriage, I asked myself a question I had never dared to consider before. Did I really know the man I had married? A few days later, I told Nicole everything. She had been my best friend since college. She had finalized a bitter divorce just 6 months earlier. Nicole listened quietly as I poured my heart out. Then she set her coffee cup down on the table, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Emily, don't lie to yourself." I felt my throat go dry. Nicole continued, "When men change, there's always a reason." I didn't respond. But on the drive home that day, her words kept replaying in my mind. For the first time, a seed called doubt had been planted, and I had no idea that before long, it would grow into something powerful enough to destroy everything I had ever believed in. People say that once trust begins to crack, you start seeing everything through a different set of eyes. I never believed that, until I lived through it myself. At first, all I wanted was a reasonable explanation. I told myself that maybe Ryan was planning a surprise gift. Maybe he was under financial pressure and didn't want me to worry. Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But with each passing day, I uncovered another piece of the puzzle that made everything seem more suspicious. Every night after Lily went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my laptop open in front of me. I started going through our bank statements. Every transaction, every expense. 10 years of marriage meant shared savings accounts, shared credit cards, and long-term financial plans built together. I knew exactly how much money we spent each month, how much went toward the mortgage, how much covered Lily's tuition, how much we'd set aside for the summer vacation we'd planned in Oregon. So when I saw thousands of dollars disappearing from our accounts, my chest tightened. $5,000, $3,000, $2,500. No notes, no explanations, not a single mention of where the money had gone. I started reading Ryan's emails. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something shameful. But I kept going. I searched for keywords like hotel, reservation, love, and weekend. Nothing obvious turned up, just ordinary work emails. Until I noticed one email address that appeared more often than the others. The sender's name simply read, Margaret M., the same letter I had seen on Ryan's phone screen that night. My throat went dry. I began tracking my husband's schedule. Ryan said he had meetings with clients in Bellevue, but the GPS location on his car showed that he had stopped at a small coffee shop nearly 30 minutes away. Some days, he claimed he had to work late. Yet he had left the office unusually early. I knew I was crossing boundaries I had never imagined crossing before. But once suspicion takes root, reason begins to give way to fear. Eventually, I hired a private investigator. The act of making that phone call alone made my hands shake. The man on the other end spoke with a calm professionalism, as though this was something he dealt with every day. Maybe it was. A week later, I got the call. "We've gathered some information." I was sitting in my car in the parking lot outside my flower shop, feeling as though I couldn't breathe. According to their report, Ryan had been meeting with a woman on multiple occasions. She was considerably older than me, somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s. The two of them met at coffee shops. Sometimes they had lunch together. Once, they sat talking for hours. There were no obvious displays of affection, but it didn't look like an ordinary professional relationship either. The report also noted that these meetings happened with surprising regularity, almost like a ritual. I stared at the photographs taken from a distance. Ryan sat across from the woman. He was listening as she spoke. His expression was serious, focused, patient. A sharp ache spread through my chest, because I couldn't remember the last time Ryan had looked at me that way. Meanwhile, the money continued to disappear from our account. His phone still lit up with lengthy calls that would abruptly end the moment I walked into the living room. "I'll call you back," he'd say before hanging up. One piece after another fell into place, until, in my mind, there was only one possible conclusion left. The man I had loved for 10 years was betraying me. That night, while Ryan was reading Lily a bedtime story, I stood outside her bedroom door. I listened to Lily's giggles as her father used silly voices to bring the characters to life. I looked at that man, the man who had held my hand at our wedding, the man who had cried when Lily was born, the man who had promised that I would never have to face life alone, and for the first time, I wondered whether all of those promises had been lies. That night, after Ryan had fallen asleep, I opened my laptop. I searched for divorce attorneys in Seattle, read about child custody, the division of assets, everything I would need to prepare before filing. I created a new folder on my computer. I named it Just in Case, for the worst case scenario. But deep down, I knew I was no longer preparing for a possibility. I was preparing for the end of the marriage I had once believed would last a lifetime. After weeks of living with suspicion, I couldn't take it anymore. I had seen the photographs from the private investigator. I had watched money disappear from our account. I had heard the phone calls that ended the moment I walked into the room. And I had convinced myself that I knew exactly what was going on. That evening, after Lily went upstairs to take her bath before bed, I stood in the kitchen watching Ryan load dishes into the dishwasher as if everything were perfectly normal. The sound of running water, the hum of the range hood, the lingering smell of grilled meat still hanging in the air, the familiar scene of a typical American family. Except, my heart was pounding out of control. "We need to talk," I said. Ryan looked up at me. "Okay, what's going on?" I didn't bother easing into it. "Who is M?" Ryan froze. The plate in his hand stopped in midair. "What are you talking about?" "Don't pretend you don't know," I said, hearing the tremor in my own voice. "The text messages, the phone calls, the late nights, the woman you've been meeting at the coffee shop. I know everything." Ryan said nothing. That silence ignited something inside me. "Are you having an affair?" I demanded. He looked at me for a long moment, long enough for me to hear the ticking of the wall clock behind me. Finally, Ryan spoke softly. "I can't explain it yet." I went completely still. Then I laughed. A bitter, disbelieving laugh. "You can't explain it yet?" I repeated. "That's all you have to say?" Ryan ran a hand over his face, as if searching for the right words. "Emily, please, I just need a little more time." But in my mind, those words meant only one thing. It was a confession. If he was innocent, why wouldn't he deny it? If he hadn't betrayed me, why wouldn't he tell me the truth? I barely slept that night. And the following Sunday morning, everything spiraled out of control. Our families had already planned to have dinner together. My parents drove up from Tacoma. Ryan's parents came down from Everett. Lily was excited to see her grandparents. She even helped me set the napkins on the table. But I walked into that dinner with a decision that, looking back now, I wish I had never made. Everyone had just sat down when I placed my fork on the table. I looked directly at Ryan. Then I said, "I think everyone deserves to know why this marriage is falling apart." The entire room went silent. Ryan looked at me. "Emily," I cut him off. "Ryan has been hiding another relationship from me." My mother gasped. Ryan's father frowned. His mother immediately turned to her son. "Ryan? Is this true?" Lily looked back and forth between all of us, confused. "Mommy, what did Daddy do wrong?" I pulled out the photographs the private investigator had taken and placed them on the table. He's been meeting another woman behind my back. Money has been disappearing from our account. His phone is full of secrets. No one said a word. Ryan sat perfectly still. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He didn't defend himself. His calmness only convinced me that I was right. Say something. I nearly shouted. At that moment, Lily burst into tears. She wrapped her arms around Ryan's arm. Daddy, are you leaving Mommy and me? Ryan bent down and pulled her into his arms. His voice was so gentle it hurt to hear. It's okay, Lily. Then he looked up at me. There was a weariness in his eyes I had never seen before. Not the look of a man who had been caught, but the look of someone carrying a burden far too heavy to bear alone. He spoke quietly. Emily, you don't know the whole truth. But by then, I didn't want to hear another word. Because in my mind, the verdict had already been delivered. And I believed that the man I had loved for 10 years was the one who had destroyed this family. 2 days after that disastrous family dinner, I returned to the house I had once called home. Ryan had already taken Lily to school. The house was wrapped in an unsettling silence. There was no television playing the morning news. No smell of the coffee Ryan brewed every single day. No sound of Lily racing down the stairs, struggling into her shoes while shouting that she was going to be late for school. There was only silence. I told myself I had come back to pick up more clothes and a few personal belongings. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew I was there for another reason. I wanted more evidence. I wanted something that would prove I had been right all along, that everything I had done had been justified. I walked into Ryan's home office. The room was as neat and orderly as ever. Books on architecture lined the shelves with meticulous precision. The black desk lamp sat exactly where it always had. Everything felt painfully familiar. Then my eyes landed on the desk. The locked drawer. The same drawer that had kept me awake night after night for weeks. I let out a slow breath. I turned to leave. But just then, I noticed something small resting on the bookshelf behind me. A silver key with an old piece of masking tape wrapped around it as a label. My hands began to tremble. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echoing inside my chest. Don't do this, Emily, I told myself. But then, I picked up the key anyway. A soft click echoed through the room as the lock released. I pulled the drawer open. There were no intimate photographs, no love letters, no hotel receipts. None of the things I had imagined finding over the past several weeks. Inside was only a thick brown envelope, a stack of files, and several neatly organized bundles of paperwork. I opened the envelope. The first words that met my eyes made the entire world stop. Department of Neurology. I turned the page, then another. Genetic testing results, MRI reports, notes from medical specialists, medical terminology I couldn't fully understand. But there was one sentence printed in bold that I couldn't possibly misread. The patient has tested positive for a rare inherited neurodegenerative disorder. A rare inherited neurodegenerative disease. My mind went blank. I sank onto the floor, still clutching the papers in my hands. I kept reading. The disease was progressing. There was no cure. Based on the current assessment, Ryan could begin losing his mobility within the next few years. A few years. I read those words over and over again, unable to comprehend them. How long had Ryan known? Why hadn't he told me? Why? I turned to the next file. This time, it contained letters from the hospital, follow-up appointment schedules, information about support groups for patients, and finally, a folder filled with financial documents, Lily's college savings fund, long-term insurance plans, investments set aside in our daughter's name, a breakdown of living expenses in the event Ryan became unable to work. There were even handwritten notes. Lily, college tuition. The mortgage needs to be paid off. Emily shouldn't have to sell the flower shop. I pressed a trembling hand over my mouth. The money disappearing from our account hadn't been spent on another woman. It had been used to protect our family's future. The woman named M might never have been a mistress at all. The secret meetings, the lengthy phone calls, Ryan's growing distance, everything I had used to convict him in my mind, suddenly became evidence of an entirely different truth. A truth I had never once considered. Ryan hadn't kept this from me because he had stopped loving me. He had kept it from me because he had been preparing for the day he would no longer be healthy enough to take care of Lily and me. I sat alone on the floor of his office, staring at the papers scattered around me, remembering that dinner, remembering every accusation I'd thrown at him, remembering the look in Lily's eyes when she broke down crying, and remembering Ryan's words, "You don't know the whole truth." For the first time in weeks, I realized something. Maybe the person I had betrayed wasn't my husband. Maybe it was the trust he had placed in me throughout our 10 years together. And that truth hurt more than any affair I had ever imagined. There are moments in life when it feels as though someone has pulled the rug out from under you. Everything you believed, every conclusion you were certain of, every ounce of anger you thought you had every right to carry. Suddenly, it all collapses. I was still sitting on the floor of Ryan's office, surrounded by files spread out around me, trying to piece together the memories of the past several months. For the first time in a very long while, I stopped looking at everything through the lens of suspicion and started looking through the lens of truth. I found a stack of business cards held together with a paper clip. The first one read, Margaret Ellis, Certified Financial Planner. I stared at the name, Margaret M., the woman I had turned into a mistress in my imagination, the woman I had hated without ever meeting, the woman I had believed had stolen my husband away from me. She had never been the other woman. She was the person Ryan had turned to in order to prepare for our family's future. I continued going through the documents. The money I had convinced myself was being spent on hotel rooms or gifts for a lover had actually been deposited into Lily's college fund. There were detailed projections of future educational expenses, tuition, housing costs, health insurance. Ryan had even added notes in his familiar handwriting. If Lily wants to study art, there still needs to be enough money for her to have that choice. I broke down in tears. Ryan had always been the practical one. I was the one who lived through emotion. I dreamed about weekend getaways to Napa Valley, remodeling our kitchen, or taking family vacations in Hawaii. Meanwhile, my husband had been quietly calculating whether our daughter would have enough money to attend college if one day he was no longer healthy enough to provide for her. I thought back to the secret meetings, the evenings Ryan came home late, the lengthy phone calls I had overheard through partially closed doors. I had imagined whispered declarations of love and stolen intimacy. But the truth was, they had been conversations about long-term care insurance, financial power of attorney, how to protect our home if he lost the ability to work, how to make sure I would never have to close the flower shop I loved so much. I remembered the exhaustion etched across Ryan's face over the past several months. The times he sat alone on the back porch after Lily had gone to bed, the distant expressions I had mistaken for indifference. Maybe it hadn't been distance at all. Maybe it had been fear. Then I found an unsent letter. My name was written on the front. Inside were a few lines of uneven handwriting. I don't know how to tell you. I don't want you to look at me and only see a sick man. I don't want Lily to grow up feeling like she has to pity her father. And if you decide you don't want this kind of life, I want it to be your choice, not your obligation. I couldn't keep reading. I folded the letter and pressed it against my chest. 10 years of marriage. 10 years together. I had always believed I knew Ryan better than anyone else. And yet I had failed to recognize that the man I loved had been facing the greatest fear of his life in complete silence. He hadn't kept this secret because he had stopped loving me. He had kept it because he loved us too much, loved us enough to shield us from his own pain, loved us enough to prepare for a future he wasn't even sure he would be strong enough to see. And what about me? While Ryan had been quietly sacrificing everything, I had been quietly condemning him. I hired a private investigator to follow my husband. I accused him in front of both of our families. I made Lily cry because I believed her father had betrayed us. I turned the man who had been trying to protect us into the villain of my own story. I looked around the room. The plans, the notes, the numbers. Every single one of them had been created for the same purpose. Not to prepare for a new life without his wife and daughter, but to make sure that no matter what happened to him, Lily and I would be okay. For the first time since all of this began, I no longer felt angry. All that remained was a pain so overwhelming it stole the breath from my lungs. Because I realized something. The most terrifying thing isn't discovering that the person you love has betrayed you. It's discovering that while they were quietly carrying unimaginable pain all by themselves, you were the first person to turn away from them. I found Ryan on a rainy Seattle afternoon. He was sitting alone in the empty bleachers of the baseball field near Lily's elementary school. The sky was overcast. Cold gusts of wind carried the scent of wet grass left behind by the morning rain. Ryan was still wearing his familiar navy jacket, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the field ahead, as though his thoughts were somewhere far beyond it. Maybe this was the first time in months that I truly saw him, not through the eyes of suspicion, not as someone searching for evidence, but as the man who had built this life with me from nothing. The man who held my hand when we received the keys to our first home. The man who spent sleepless nights pacing the hallway with Lily in his arms while she cried through the pain of teething. The man who still made coffee for me every morning, even though he was always the one who had to leave for work first. I sat down beside him. Silence stretched between us. Finally, I spoke. I opened the drawer. Ryan closed his eyes for a brief moment. He didn't look surprised. He wasn't angry. He simply gave a small nod. "How long have you known?" I asked. 10 months. 10 months. Almost an entire year. I turned to look at him. For the first time, I realized how exhausted Ryan looked. The dark circles beneath his eyes, the shoulders that had always seemed so steady now appeared weighed down by something invisible. I couldn't hold it anymore. The tears started falling. "Why?" I choked out. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ryan lowered his eyes to his hands. It was a long while before he finally spoke, because I was scared. I looked at him. The man I had always believed was stronger than anyone else, admitting for the first time that he was afraid. Ryan let out a humorless laugh. "I was afraid of seeing pity in your eyes." His voice was so soft it nearly disappeared into the wind. "I didn't want to become a sick man in your eyes. I didn't want Lily growing up worrying every day whether her dad would still be healthy next year." He paused, took a deep breath, "And I didn't want you to feel trapped." I started crying harder. Ryan turned to look at me. His eyes were red-rimmed. "But the thing that hurt the most," he said slowly, "was that you never asked me if I was okay." His words pierced straight through my heart. Because he was right. For months, all I had asked was, "What are you hiding from me? Who is M? Where have you been? What are you doing behind my back?" I had never stopped to ask, "Ryan, are you okay?" I wiped at my tears. My voice trembled. "I'm sorry." I looked out at the empty baseball field in front of us. "I thought I was angry because I was afraid you'd betrayed me. The thought of you loving someone else drove me insane." I took a shaky breath. But the truth is, I turned to face him. I was afraid of being left behind. I was afraid of waking up one day and realizing I was no longer the most important person in your life. Afraid of raising Lily on my own. Afraid of losing the life we'd built together. Afraid of a future I couldn't control. Ryan was quiet for a long time. Then he smiled. A sad smile touched with exhaustion and relief. He lifted a hand and wiped away the tears on his own cheeks. "Me too." Just 3 words. But they were probably the most honest conversation we'd had in years. 2 people sitting side by side on the cold bleachers of a small baseball field in Seattle. No more accusations, no more secrets. No more assumptions, born out of fear. Just a wife afraid of losing her husband, and a husband afraid of becoming a burden to the family he loved. For the first time in many months, we stopped trying to protect each other through silence and began learning how to face the truth together. A few weeks after that conversation at the baseball field, our lives didn't suddenly become perfect. Ryan still had to go to the hospital for regular checkups. Doctor's appointments were still marked on the family calendar in red ink. The good days were still mixed with days filled with worry. And the future, it was still a question mark that none of us could answer. But one thing had changed. For the first time in years, we stopped pretending that everything was fine. We started talking to each other. Really talking. One evening while we were washing dishes, Ryan admitted that he was afraid Lily would one day have to remember her father through old photographs. I confessed that I still woke up in the middle of the night terrified of losing him. There were conversations that left us both in tears. There were conversations that made us laugh as we realized how much time we'd wasted trying to guess what the other person was thinking instead of simply asking how they were feeling. On one of Seattle's rare sunny Sunday mornings, we decided to drive to the coast. Lily sat in the back seat, eating a donut and singing along to the songs playing on the radio. Ryan drove. One hand rested on the steering wheel. The other held mine, just as it had so many years before. We drove along the shoreline. Lily ran barefoot across the sand, trying to chase the seagulls flying low overhead. Her laughter blended with the sound of the crashing waves. Ryan stood beside me, watching our daughter, and quietly said, "I used to think I had to carry all of this by myself to protect you and Lily." I squeezed his hand gently, and I used to think I had to prepare for the worst in order to protect myself. We looked at each other. Neither of us knew how much healthy time Ryan had left. Maybe many years. Maybe less than we'd hoped. The truth is, none of us are guaranteed tomorrow. But for the first time in a long while, we stopped living inside our worst assumptions. No more stories written by fear inside our own minds. No more secrets hidden in the name of protecting the people we love. We learned how to listen. We learned how to admit when we were vulnerable. We learned how to speak our fears instead of burying them beneath silence. And most importantly, we learned how to fall in love with each other all over again. Not the passionate kind of love you have in your 20s, but a love that had matured, a love that ran deeper, a love that chose to hold on to each other's hands, even knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Because sometimes love isn't found in the promise that everything will be okay. Sometimes it's found in the simple words, no matter what happens, we'll face it together. If this story leaves you with anything, maybe it's this. Sometimes what destroys a relationship isn't betrayal. It's the stories fear tells us inside our own heads. We see a text message and assume the worst. We notice distance and write a heartbreaking ending before the story has even unfolded. We convict the people we love before giving them the chance to explain. So before you decide that the person beside you has changed, try asking them a simple question. Are you okay? Are you doing all right? Do you want to talk? What can I do to help? Sometimes, one sincere question is enough to save a relationship before it's too late. What about you? If you were Emily, would you be able to forgive yourself after everything that happened? If you were Ryan, would you have the courage to tell the truth from the very beginning? Or would you choose silence to protect the people you love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to know what choice you think you would make if you were in their situation. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button to support the channel. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss more heartfelt stories from everyday life. Stories where every choice comes with a price, and every person is fighting battles that others cannot see. Thank you for staying with me until the very last moment. I'll see you in the next video.